Hey, Ashley,
Hey,
are you
John.
there? Hey, how's it going?
I'm here. I'm good. How are you doing?
Pretty good, all things considered. Let me introduce myself and then I'll introduce you and then we can have a little chat. My name is John Horgan. I'm a science journalist and I also teach at Stevens Institute of Technology. And my department, which includes the humanities and social sciences, uh, wants to tell prospective students who we are and what we do. Uh, and so I am recording some conversations with some of my colleagues in the College of Arts and Letters, which includes humanities and social sciences and so forth. And so today with me is one of my wonderful colleagues, Professor Ashely Lytle, who teaches psychology. So, Ashley, could you start off just by telling us why you decided to become a professor of psychology?
Oh, great question. So, I really have been interested in psychology, I think, since elementary school when I got into murder mystery books and started reading about serial killers. And I decided I was really interested in human behavior. My interests since then have kind of diverged quite wildly to being interested in social and health psychology, so more interested in kind of general patterns of human behavior, predicting behavior, and then a lot of my research focuses on stereotyping and prejudice and how do we reduce negative attitudes and negative perceptions of different groups.
Well, that sounds very relevant to the public conversation that the whole country is having right now. So, do you end up talking about, for example, racism and sexism in your courses?
I do. So I just recently taught psychology of prejudice for the first time in spring 2020. And so in that class, we covered all different types of prejudice directed towards different groups. So we talked about race, we talked about gender, we talked about sexual orientation, we talk about age, we talk about ability status. And then we kind of finished talking about how do we reduce prejudice and how do we make things more equitable in society. And towards the end of the semester, there were quite a few things happening. There was the shooting of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. So a lot of students wrote about that in a final paper. So we were seeing kind of the application of some of what we were discussing in class to real world examples of bias and sometimes violence directed towards people of different groups.
So, in your class, you are in your courses, you are responsive to current events. I'm
Mhm.
curious, to what degree do you express your own opinions in class? I'm asking this, I'm really curious because I tend to be a blabbermouth. It's impossible for me not to vent my opinions in class. And I just wonder what my colleagues do when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I try to base it in the science. So what does the science about prejudice or stereotyping tell us? So we might know that a lot of people say don't have intentions to be biased towards others, even though that might not be how things kind of play out in the real world. So I try to always kind of back it up with research studies or what we know from the literature about whatever the topic is. So as much as possible, I guess try to make it objectively focused on the research, even though true objectivity is probably impossible to a certain
Yeah,
extent.
it strikes me that um, psychology is interesting because it's kind of like putting the mirror up to ourselves, and it seems to me that a lot of modern psychology is focused on all the immense varieties of human irrationality.
Mm-hmm.
And we as humanities, or as professors in humanities and social sciences, are supposed to teach critical thinking. And it seems to me that the kinds of things you're teaching are related very much to critical thinking. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. And so in the psych of prejudice class that I was mentioning earlier, the way that I started off the course was talking about, we have all these different well-documented cognitive biases. So things like the fundamental attribution error, where if someone that I meet in public is rude to me, I might assume that they are a rude person, rather than thinking about maybe situational factors, that they're running late for something, their kid is sick at home, something that might be impacting their behavior. Whereas if I'm rude to somebody else, so if I'm rude to you today, John, I probably wouldn't think, well, I'm just a jerk. I'd probably think, well, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. So that's one of these kind of fundamental human behaviors that all of us engage in at different times that we don't necessarily always see, but it's a core thing that kind of pervades across all different sorts of boundaries. So just pointing out that those sorts of things exist, and again, a bunch of other cognitive biases that we have, and then leading that into, if we can agree that we all do these sorts of things when we're not talking about something as charged as prejudice, why would it be any different when we're talking about biases that come along with social groups and our interactions with social groups?
So, as I was just saying, we're in the College of Arts and Letters, so we're I teach journalism. We're lumped together with the traditional humanities, literature, philosophy, history. To what extent do you think of psychology as belonging to the humanities as opposed to science?
That's a good question. I think traditionally, I think of it more being oriented within the sciences, but it definitely can tie into humanities as well. But in terms of the way that I teach the course and a lot of the resources that I use in the course, either textbooks or peer-reviewed journal articles, I feel like I kind of lean more towards the science side of things.
Here's a related question, I guess. To what extent is there a dominant framework or paradigm in psychology today? So in the past, early in the 20th century, I guess Freudian psychoanalysis was very influential. Then you had behaviorism. Is there a dominant framework today, analogous to those of the past?
So I would say not that I could think of. I usually within the subfield. So I'm a social and health psychologist. There's kind of overarching ways that we might think about the world or we might study the world, compared to like evolutionary psychologists might think of the world differently than a social psychologist. One is kind of more focused on the interactions with other. Social psychology is more focused on attitudes, behaviors, perceptions, and the interactions with other people, how that kind of influences our world. Evolutionary psychology would be more focused on how evolution has affected our behaviors over time.
Right. How much history of psychology do you get into in your classes, or any?
Yeah, good question. I usually like to start off with like the seminal study in an area, and then kind of bring that to what modern day research says about that topic. So for example, we might talk about the Milgram study if we're talking about obedience to authority, but then what does that look like today in terms of the research that's being done? And then of course, there's classic seminal studies in psychology that have come under fire recently because of the replication crisis. So I try to make sure to bring up where there are inconsistencies in findings and how the science is trying to get better, and some of the ways the field is trying to kind of move forward and do away with some of the techniques and methods that maybe set us up not to be as scientific as we thought we were.
So to what extent do you address mental illness? So some of the pathologies that our minds are subject to in your courses?
Yeah, so in my fundamentals of psychology, or our kind of version of intro psychology, I usually do a section on mental health and clinical psychology, but otherwise I don't touch on it a terrible amount. I usually talk about it a little bit in health psychology as well. And then I talk about kind of the flip side that psychology is now focused on, which is kind of the happiness research. So some of the research focuses on mental health issues, and then some of it focuses on how do you like promote human flourishing and promote happiness and gratitude.
So this might be an unfair question, but to what extent does knowledge about how the mind works help you in your own life? And I guess I could apply that to students. To what extent can we expect learning about the science of psychology that kind of knowledge would lead to personal happiness and fulfillment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think going back to what I was talking about with cognitive biases, you still make the same sort of mistakes that everybody else makes, the same sort of errors in judgment or perception. I often can recognize after I do so why my kind of brain immediately went to that judgment, and then try to kind of walk through what's the reality of the situation versus what's my perception here. So I wouldn't say it necessarily stops some of those kind of basic instincts that we have, but it can help us be more reflective and maybe start to question or push back on some of the knee-jerk reactions that we might have to a situation or to a certain person or whatever the context might be.